Hello everyone, I'm Captain Logan and it's not Spawn year. It's day 58 of my comic review video day calendar. I didn't think I was going to do any Star Trek in this series because I've been keeping it pretty much to superhero. I might make an exception a couple of times during this year if I see something I just really want to weigh in on in my collection. But since Spawn itself was ostensibly a superhero thing, I wanted to keep it mostly to characters and costumes. And so I didn't figure Star Trek, Star Wars, any of that kind of stuff would come up this show. And then I remembered that there were Star Trek X-Men crossovers, which is really strange. A lot of counterintuitive, bizarre ideas with these. And I was flipping through my boxes and I went, oh yeah, that's right. Star Trek Next Generation X-Men Second Contact. We got to take a look at this. It's crazy. And I don't think I've tackled this in the past. I went into my archives and I couldn't find a video on it. So if I have talked about it, it might have been on an old comic book late night or something like that. But I didn't have a singular video on it. And if I did talk about it, it was probably 10 years ago. So I figure might as well go ahead and get into this. The reason I went with this and not the first X-Men Star Trek crossover, because believe it or not, there are two of them. There's a TOS one, and then there's this one. I went to this because, I always thought it was just a super strange idea and a really funny title. A Second Contact, get it? Because it's a sequel to First Contact. But it's also a double entendre title because this is the second time that Star Trek characters and X-Men characters are meeting, although here it's some of the same X-Men, like Wolverine, who remembers Captain Kirk, but because this is in continuity with that, and this very much wants to keep all the X-Men stuff, at least, in continuity. It's treating it like it all counts and it all matters. Certainly it won't for the Star Trek side. It's not like anybody in Screen Trek remembers any of this, but the X-Men side, I don't know if it's ever brought up in X-Men comic apart from Star Trek, probably not, but it certainly reads like this is supposed to matter, this is supposed to count, and I guess editorial was concerned about that as well, because there's a write-up at the end of this that's kind of nice, that explains the making of this and how difficult it was getting the two offices to sign off on things. And that's always difficult when you have a crossover with companies that are not usually connected and talking to each other. And so you can be a comic publisher that has the rights to multiple franchises that are owned by different companies. And so if you want to cross them over, it's not as simple as just, oh, well, they're all in the same house. Marvel makes Star Trek comics, so it can also make a Star Trek X-Men crossover. Not necessarily. Paramount has to sign off on stuff. The Star Trek office at Marvel, which there was one at that time, it was doing Voyager comics, among other things, has to sign off on that stuff. IDW wouldn't get the license until a little while later. And at one time, DC had Star Trek. It jumps around all over the place. So there's a write-up at the end talking about how when they were putting this together, the only thing the X-Men office cared about was that this book didn't kill off any characters, which again is really funny because I don't think the continuity of it should matter. In fact, I say this a lot with crossover stuff, so that we can get away from having to, having too much of the story being about how do these two worlds even get together. Wouldn't it be nice if this was just an Elseworlds, for lack of a better term, sort of thing, and just say, Star Trek is the future of X-Men. Go. It'd be cooler if they were in the same continuity in the first place. And in fact, I'll talk about this later, but it's kind of difficult to tell if some of that isn't already supposed to be the case. This is really having its cake and eating it too, in being a multiversal crossover and also Star Trek maybe being the future of X-Men. So again, I'll talk about that. But yeah, the Marvel editorial was concerned about continuity, apparently, and that's all they really cared about. And something that's kind of interesting is that, because I didn't know this, is that if you, and I don't know if this is still the case, but if you wanted to put together, if you wanted to have likenesses of real people, those actors have to sign off on it themselves. I don't know why they have that much power in their contracts, or if that's just a legal thing. So apparently, like Michael Dorn and Marina Sirtis and Jonathan Frakes and Patrick Stewart, all these guys had to look at the initial concept art from this and say, yeah, that looks enough like me. I don't mind that being in a comic book. It's really interesting, how little control they have over the actual work that they put on screen, and it's probably different with different contracts and different projects, but generally speaking, I think even if an actor leaves a job or gets out of a contract early, if the company has filmed material with them, they're able to still flash back to it and use it. But then I guess there's been situations where they can't do that. So I guess different circumstances are different. But I just thought it was really interesting that those guys actually had to look at this and say, yeah, I'm okay with this being the likeness, because I guess if they didn't, they would have to get a different writer or a different artist. But anyway, the other reason, I meant to say this earlier, that I decided to go ahead and do this instead of the original series crossover, which maybe I'll review at some point down the line, but probably not for Not Spawn Year now, because it would be not for Not Spawn Year, because it would be strange going backwards, is because the main villain in this is Kang, of all characters. It's not an X-Men villain. It's kind of an odd choice. Everything about this is a lot of odd, counterintuitive choices. But we've been talking a lot about Kang lately on the channel because Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania just came out a couple weeks ago as of this recording. And so I figured, Kang's in this. I'll go ahead and talk about it. This is written by a duo, but not the duo you might expect. We've got Dan Abnett, but he's not working with Lanning, and I guess he has done some Star Trek work. That's what it sounded like from the article at the end of this about the making of this. And Ian Eddington, who I think maybe wrote some of the Voyager comics, but wrote some Star Trek for Marvel. And then Kerry Nord pencils this, and he is a newcomer as of this crossover. This comes out in 1998, by the way, 2 years after First Contact. But the story itself takes place, it says 1 minute after First Contact, but this artist was drawing Daredevil and Wolverine for Marvel, and I've reviewed at least one comic that he drew because he also did Amalgam Bruce Wayne Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., which I talked about a few years ago when I was doing a series on that, and I've now come back and done quite a bit more Amalgam just this year, but it was kind of interesting to see that in that write-up, that was one of the things that he had under his belt. The art in this I'll talk about real briefly before I get into the story. I think is serviceable. It's decent. I think the likenesses for the Star Trek characters in particular are really good. It is, or at least like I buy them. It looks enough like these characters. I get why these actors signed off on that. It's a little bit strange seeing real life likenesses mixed with original designs for characters not played by actors. And it's kind of sad that Professor X doesn't show up in this, given that he's played by Patrick Stewart in the movies. And I don't know if he had already been cast, if we knew a lot in 1998 about what was going to happen in that movie. I think maybe so, because that comes out summer of 2000. But it would only be a couple of years before Patrick Stewart is playing that character. And it's really interesting looking at the novel Planet X that comes out after this, which is actually advertised at the end of this. So this comic ends up basically just being a prologue for a novel. See, everything about this is really strange. And I read that when I was a kid. It's been a long time. I've got a copy of it. I've wanted to review that forever, and I just haven't gone back to it. But now that I've read this again, I don't know. I've got too much on my plate, but it'd be nice to read that again and talk about it. Maybe I'll do that at some point. But anyway, that's advertised at the end of this comic, so that's already in the pipeline and supposed to come out a couple of months after this, and was probably written without any knowledge that Patrick Stewart was also playing Xavier. And I do remember that he and Picard have page time together or in scenes together in that novel. So yeah, this whole thing is crazy. I read this without knowing that the original series crossover had happened. So when Wolverine in this comes out and is like, "Oh, the Enterprise, are you some of Kirk's people?" I was like, "Oh, wait a minute. This is a thing. Like he already somehow knows Kirk. That's weird." So I went and looked into that, and I have a copy of that now. I think I found that in a collection and that I bought out and hung on to it. So anyway, let's go ahead and get into the story here, shall we? Like I said, this takes place 1 minute after First Contact, and we've got some technobabble about the deflector dish. You remember, if you've seen Star Trek First Contact, the Borg are trying to contact their brethren in the Delta Quadrant, and they start monkeying around with the deflector, and apparently they damaged something there, and Geordi says that they need to replace a core, and not the warp core, some other core that is related to the deflector dish, and he says it's lucky that we were able to go anywhere. They don't seem to have any trouble leaving and going back home at the end of this, but I guess somehow something, the deflector is messed up, and that makes us go backwards instead of forwards. Okay, they just need some kind of easy contrivance, some plot device to make that happen. And they wind up in the 1990s, and they do the same gag that Star Trek IV does, where they say, judging by the pollution content in the atmosphere, this is the year that we're in. But then it turns out that we're not just in the past, but we're also in another reality. And somehow, also very conveniently, this is built on a series of like time travel and cosmic coincidences. Somehow they wound up in a world of gazillions of umpteen endless numbers of parallel universes. They wound up in the same one that Kirk ended up in with X-Men, unless that's not the case and it's just another universe where that also happened, because it's by TNG we say it's many worlds theory. We've got the episode Parallels that says that for every choice you make, another universe is created. So with Kirk not being here, I guess it's possible that's not the Kirk they met. I don't know that for sure, but I suspect that the idea is supposed to be that this is a true follow-up to that, and that all parties involved would remember being involved. But it's a moot point now, because Kirk has already gone through generations and been in the Nexus and then died, so yeah. So they're stuck in the 90s. They've got to figure out, with the X-Men, they got to figure out how to get back to their own universe, but then the bigger issue ends up being, oh no, our just being here is messing up the space-time continuum. So it's that kind of story. And like I said, wouldn't it be so much more interesting if we made it a regular time travel plot and said that in the future of the X-Men, you get the Federation? And I think it's actually weirdly natural to put these two things together, by the way, thematically. And I wish this wasn't so plot-driven, because there's no real interesting character arcs here, and we're not talking about any of what X-Men and Star Trek are about, really. This is all crossover novelty and nothing more, and I don't expect it to get real heavy and serious and smart about it or anything, but like a little would go a long way in just having a brief conversation somewhere. Wouldn't it be nice if Picard was like thoughtful TV Picard and not action movie Picard? I mean, I realize it's right after First Contact, so he might seem half out of character all of a sudden if you reverted back to, season 5 and 6, and 7, TV show Picard. But wouldn't it be nice if somebody had a conversation about how the X-Men are trying to create a world of tolerance, and where different kinds of people can all live together in peace and embrace their differences? where they can peacefully cohabitate as Xavier wants. And the Federation, the future of the 23rd and 24th century, is one where that, for humanity anyway, has happened, where that's worked out. And what Professor X wants is the world that Picard lives in. And there's no discussion about that. Maybe they talk about it in the TOS crossover, I don't remember, but it's so plot-driven where it's just, we have this surface-level sci-fi problem that we have to solve. It's all technobabble, it's all plot devices and Deus Ex Machina, and we'll get to the Deus Ex Machina in a little bit, because it's kind of the obvious thing if you're into Star Trek, if you're into TNG. And it's all completely superficial and surface level. And that's kind of disappointing because those ideas really do go together. And I suspect that the novel probably goes into those ideas a lot more and gets more thoughtful about it because it's got the space to do that, to be fair. It is a book, but you'd think this is oversized. This is like 57 pages. It's more than double a standard comic book. You'd think maybe it would get into that stuff just a little bit. One of the things that I alluded to this earlier that's confusing about this is what actually exists according to this in the Star Trek universe from the Marvel universe. So at the beginning, Picard says there is, or maybe it's Data that mentions it, the technology that we need to fix the deflector and get home doesn't exist in the 1990s. But then we realize, oh wait, yes it does, because somewhere on Earth there's Shi'ar-derived technology, and that's what we need. Well, the Shi'ar is an X-Men thing, and they're familiar with the Shi'ar, and they don't even realize that Wolverine and some of the other X-Men have met Kirk before. So we're already talking about characters and terminology and alien species from the Marvel Universe on the Star Trek side. So again, why make it a multi-dimensional thing in the first place? Well, I guess because you have to contrive this Kang plot. You have to contrive some reason that reality is starting to intermingle again. And my eyes glaze over, by the way, when we do these plots now, which is why I and a lot of other people are having a hard time getting as invested in the multiverse saga for the MCU as we want to, because you get these kinds of stories that, again, just feel too plot-driven, and the stakes are so big that it's difficult to create any kind of like clever or imaginative solution to them, where a character uses ingenuity and resourcefulness and comes up with a way out, because the rules are often so vague. And I don't think the MCU has done a real good job of establishing their rules for the multiverse. They keep kind of They keep kind of bringing up stuff that seems to contradict stuff they brought up before, and it just doesn't seem to be, the best plan for all of that. And I don't mean to just use this as an excuse to bash the way MCU is doing multiverse, but I'm getting to it. Like, I've always been a fan of multiversal stuff, and even I am starting to lose interest in it and get kind of burnt out on it. And it's because, like with time travel, and this is both, it's so easy to use it as a replacement for actual storytelling and, giving characters in actual interesting arc and letting them have any kind of self-discovery, and just going, well, we've got to get back home. How are we going to do that? Oh, we figured out a way to do that. Something, plot device, or technobabble, and then we made it back home. And there's a lot of Star Trek time travel that's like that as well. So anyway, I don't think it's an especially compelling story because of that. And so it also just seems like a really fickle, fragile timeline in a way X-Men and Star Trek have never really been, where just the Enterprise being in this universe is destabilizing the entire multiverse. Okay. Kang comes in and says that, and we can't trust him because he's Kang and he's the conqueror, and he tends to be thinking 5 steps ahead, and he's a master manipulator, right? And we'll ultimately find out that he is indeed doing that. But you get this page where Kang is saying, we need to send teams to 2 different time periods in the universe that is being created by the universe's blending, what we're stuck in right now. We basically have a DC crisis going on here. And there's even a line, weirdly, where I forget who it is, but somebody starts to say the word crisis and gets cut off, almost like we want to make a reference to it and how DC this is, but we're not actually going to come right out and use the word. That was weird. But the idea is, so Kang says there are these 2 key moments where things are happening that aren't supposed to, and you need to fix those, or the entire space-time continuum is going to collapse in on itself. And we'll find out later on from our Deus Ex Machina characters, who turn out to be the Traveler and Wesley Crusher. Yay, they come in and get involved in this. And I was going to say, I don't know if it's our universe's version or the X-Men's, but I guess it ends up being a moot point because we're mixing everything. So I don't know how all of the other parallel universes are involved with this, but it seems like we're winding up with just one that's a hodgepodge of everything. Okay, I guess that sort of kind of explains that. But not really, but I think it thinks it does, so whatever. But anyway, the idea is Kang is manipulating things, so he's giving half-truths. It turns out that it is actually the case that that the Enterprise's appearance here is destabilizing reality, but it is not true that the things he says they need to fix actually need to be fixed. In fact, it's the only thing Wesley Crusher says is holding the timeline together as best it can. So the idea is like the universe and time moving toward entropy, it's trying to repair itself as best as possible. So if it's stuck with these 2 different versions of reality, it's going to mesh them in a way that will keep the whole thing from imploding, so it can remain stable. And so those 2 instances are, and this is so weird, are that in so we have 2 teams that go to 2 different time periods, and one of them is Wolf 359. We have to make these major battles in major almost dystopian moments in the X-Men's case, a total dystopian moment in the respective histories, and a lot of it is just the novelty of getting to see these things again. So with Wolf 359, you've got to have you have a character from the X-Men that's not supposed to be there and who is dead, and that's John Proudstar. And so we're kind of going back to yesterday's Enterprise in a way with that. This whole thing, by the way, is much more of a Star Trek story than an X-Men story. So if you know your X-Men really well, but you don't really understand the Star Trek stuff, you're going to be a lot more lost than if you have it the other way around. If you really know TNG, and DS9 helps too with this because we deal with Cisco a little bit, but if you really know your TNG, not knowing anything about X-Men is not going to make you lost, but it doesn't work very well the other direction. So John Proudstar is a dead character who is inserted into Wolf 359, and that's supposed to somehow help stabilize the timeline. And then this is all even more hokey and random when I'm talking about it out loud, I'm finding. And then we go to Days of Future Past, and Tasha Yar is there, and is a mutant and has telepathic abilities so that she can be the new Kitty Pryde and be sent back, her mind sent back in time like Kitty Pryde was, so that they can make the whole Days of Future Past thing work. That's very strange, but I mentioned yesterday's Enterprise. It's also that because it's specifically Tasha Yar who was dead and comes back to life, but in the Days of Future Past timeline. it's kind of interesting paralleling, not that the story does anything with this idea, but paralleling the Sentinels with the Borg. So you have two cybernetic or just completely robotic organisms that want to, that are obsessed with perfection, and in the Sentinels case, of course, they're programmed, but both of them are through either trying to destroy a whole civilization through genocide, or assimilating races. They're trying to take things that they can't tolerate and can't just leave alone and let be the way they want to be, and let people have their freedoms, and take over, and try to create their sense of perfection, of bettering something. And they do it in kind of opposite ways, but in some ways, I guess there's an argument to be made that there's not that much of a difference between what the Sentinels do and what the Borg do, because at the end of the day, you're taking away free will, and you're not having tolerance of what you see as imperfections. And then we do what strikes me as a very kind of Doctor Who sort of move in putting the two of them together by the end, and so we end up with Sentinels that are controlled by the Borg. I'm trying to find that. There's, by the way, Wesley Crusher. Look at his face. That has a weird face. The art, by the way, seems to kind of deteriorate as it goes along, almost like the artist, almost like Nord had a deadline that he was running up against, having a hard time finishing. And according to the behind-the-scenes article at the end of this, they had a really good schedule and didn't have any problem pacing it. So that's apparently not the case, but it looks that way to me. You start getting weirder faces and less detail and less stuff in the background as you move along with this. I don't like Cisco's face model as well as some of the others, by the way. But anyway, so you end up with Sentinels here that are being controlled by Borg, which is a real fun image, and there's kind of a clear, a clear symbol there. But like I said, the story doesn't really do very much with it, and so, like I said, you've got your Deus Ex Machina with Wesley Crusher and the Traveler showing up saying, hey, Kang, I guess they just know everything because they're time travelers. They go, Kang is being duplicitous, and he is actually trying to change what the universe is doing in order to keep things stable for his own ends so that he can take over. So there's like specific reasons for Tasha Yar and Proudstar to be there. The idea is if, or I'm sorry, not actually even that whole thing is weird. That's just the universe going, we put these things from Star Trek in this X-Men world, and then in vice versa, and then we can keep the reality together. Whatever. It feels very amalgam, actually. But no, I misspoke. There's specific reasons that Kang needs those two things to fall apart, but then he's going to replace them with something. He wants to mold the universe in his own image, kind of like Doctor Doom does in Secret Wars. And he goes, well, if Cisco dies in Wolf 359, then he can't meet the Prophets. And then the Prophets won't be able to stop me because they have we talk about in this unique relationship with time, and they have this kind of cosmic awareness and might be a threat to me. And for some reason, he needs Days of Future Past to also work out in the Sentinel's favor. And I don't fully understand that whole thing. That's not really talked about. But the reason it's Cisco is talked about. It does have that problem, too, where we get cutesy about bringing up titles of things in the dialogue. At one point, I'm forgetting what characters are talking half the time with this because nobody really comes alive in this. They're all just kind of, mouthpieces for things. But you have a line where somebody goes, "In these days of future past," and I'm like, all right. There's another place where when the Sentinels and the Borg combine, it's the worst of these two worlds. Okay, I get it. You know the titles of episodes and of comic books. Then, when you get to the end of this, and one big question I have, by the way, is if the Traveler shows up, why don't, 15 other cosmically aware or omnipotent characters in Star Trek, and even the Marvel Universe for that matter, pop in? Where is Q during all of this? You'd think, the Q Continuum would have a vested interest in all of this, if not just Q himself. And so, anyway, finally, we defeat Kang because luckily the Traveler showed up, and we have this cliffhanger at the end that isn't even really a cliffhanger, except just to say something is happening and we're going to continue, and there's a novel. I don't know why we're not looking at what the X-Men are seeing at the end of this, but it's like, oh yay, the Enterprise is left, they're finally going to get home. I guess we fixed the deflector and all of that, and Wolverine's like, oh my God, there's something, or Nightcrawler, and then Wolverine, there's something there. Oh no, and there's a bright light, and then that's it, and you're supposed to read that novel. It's weird that we don't see what they're looking at. There's not any hook here. It's just they're seeing something, and this keeps going. You're gonna get more of this. We don't really do very much with the X-Men characters. It kind of doesn't matter which ones we're using here. And like I said, it's much more of a Star Trek story than it is an X-Men story. And there are some hilarious lines of dialogue in this too, particularly from Picard. There's one place where he says, I will not allow anyone to eviscerate my crew members. And then Deanna Troi says, "That's a wonderful sentiment, Captain." Abnett's not exactly on his best game here, I don't think. There's awkward stuff, you have two Star Trek or Enterprise crew members and two X-Men that at various points in the book, someone, a woman, calls them boys, and they both go, "Boys?" It's kind of awkward and coincidental that 2 pages away from each other, they both do that. So it's supposed to be a fun callback thing, but it read kind of weird and cringy in the moment. But yeah, this is an odd novelty. It's fun, it's ridiculous, but I think there are certainly missed opportunities with it, particularly with the page count. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and get going, but I will see you again tomorrow with another one. No idea what I'm reviewing yet. It won't be Star Trek, and it probably won't be X-Men, but I will talk about something interesting, I am sure. And like I said, maybe down the road, I'll go back to the Star Trek X-Men crossover land and take a look at more of this and talk about it. This had me thinking, I meant to say this earlier, this had me thinking, as fanficky as this is, because it really is, and as fanficky an idea as it would be to do this, right at this, or not this period, but a few years later, as Patrick Stewart is finishing Star Trek and continuing to make X-Men movies, it might have been cool if those companies could play ball together. And of course, they wouldn't have really. But if Paramount and Fox could have gotten together and do a Star Trek X-Men crossover movie, I see the obvious appeal for fans of both things, and particularly, fans of Screen X-Men who just really like Patrick Stewart. There'd be a neat novelty to see him play both characters and maybe just not even acknowledge the fact that they look and sound the same. But again, just with the ideas of what X-Men is all about and being worried that the future is going to look like Days of Future Past, but with the hope that it could look like the Federation future of Star Trek, there's definitely potential there, and that would have been the only time to make it, would have been, after Nemesis, 03, 04, get past X2, do it instead of X3 or just before that. I mean, it would be really, really strange, of course, if you only got 2 X-Men movies and the next thing you did was a big crossover thing. Yeah, kind of like it was weird to do First Contact and then the very next X-Men movie was a crossover thing with the 2 sort of X-Men franchises or X-Men cast anyway with Days of Future Past. But it would have been a way to actually do Days of Future Past, I think. Never would have happened. Crazy idea to even bring up and talk about. But seeing that here in comics, I just find myself going, I don't know, if it was possible, it could have been neat if it was written right. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching, folks, and I'll see you again tomorrow. I didn't mean for this to be the longest episode so far of Not Spawn Year, but once again, I'll bring up something tomorrow, and have a good one. I'm Captain Logan, and happy reading.